Thank you, Barack. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here in this distinguished company at what I take as the inaugural conference and what will be recognized as the premier forum for the discussion of these topics. You've read the lines of my paper, so I would propose to spend my time focusing or reading between the lines, giving you some of the backstory and what is on my mind as I write this. Much of my work started 8 years ago when I was charged with stewardship of the American Federal Civil Rights Agency, which is responsible for ensuring non-discrimination in colleges, universities, and public schools. At that time, there was a spate of incidents in which people alleged anti-Semitism on a series of university campuses in the United States. And there were also some post-9/11 allegations of discrimination against not only Muslims, but also Sikhs and other groups. And yet, my agency turned out to be charged with the peculiar responsibility, the unique responsibility of overseeing a wide range of civil rights laws that did not mention religion. They prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and even membership in certain patriotic youth organizations, but nothing about religion. And we can talk about why later, but that was the fact. And on inquiry, it turned out that none of my successors believed that Jews were in any way covered by those categories, that someone claiming anti-Semitism should be told, we're sorry to hear this, you should probably hire a lawyer, but Jews are a religion. So this is not your agency. But if you have a housing problem or an employment problem, there are agencies that you can go to that do cover Jews. I clarified that policy. When a bureaucrat says he's clarifying a policy, that means he's reversing it. And I said that henceforth, Sikhs, Jews, members of other religious groups that also have ethnic or ancestral characteristics will be protected from discrimination to the same extent as if they had the ethnic or ancestral characteristics, but not the religion. It seemed intuitive to me, but not to any of my successors. The policy was scrupulously followed until the day I left the agency, and from that point forward was ignored for the following half dozen years, during which I wrote a book and a series of academic articles addressing the question, are Jews a race in the specific meaning of the civil rights law? And to the question, are Jews a race, I found that the answer was obviously no, but that obvious answer turned out to be wrong in a lot of different respects, so that I ended up concluding, unsurprisingly, that the policy was right, and that in fact Jews should be covered under a statute that prohibits race, national origin, and color discrimination. About a year ago, after much discussion from within the Jewish community, the Obama administration changed course yet again and endorsed my 2004 policy. So since the end of 2010, the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education is now again on the record saying that it will prosecute at least certain forms of anti-Semitism. I argued at that time that the success of this policy will depend on three things. One is, can they figure out what anti-Semitism is? So now much of my work has been trying to explain when is something alleged to be anti-Semitic by a Jewish student actually anti-Semitic, when is it not? Second is, can they figure out what is protected free speech and what is not? And the third is, will Congress close the remaining loophole and prohibit religious discrimination? Because after all, some forms of anti-Semitism and some other forms of discrimination against religious groups is not ethnic or ancestral in any way that's at least plausible to me. And why should a bigot be able to defend himself on the ground that, no, it's not racist, it's just religious bigotry, therefore I'm okay. I argued this in a couple of law review papers 5 or 6 years ago. It has subsequently been written into legislation, which has been introduced but which has largely languished. Congress has not addressed the topic. The Jewish community has not largely gotten behind the idea until last week, when a large umbrella organization of Jewish groups has gotten behind this issue and is now pushing to prohibit at least some forms of religious discrimination in the public schools. Previously, I had asked the question, are Jews a race in a legally meaningful way? Thought the answer was obviously no, but that the obvious answer was wrong. More recently, I've started asking the question, well, are Jews a religion in the operative way? For which the answer, I think, is an obvious yes. But now the question is that obvious yes, does that hold up when we think about the way in which religion is addressed in at least the American constitutional tradition? And that is the question that was on my mind as I write this paper. And as I came to see that there are different ways of understanding what is religious freedom in the American constitutional tradition. And I came to identify that there are three, at least primary ways that occurred to me. First, there was what I have seen as a traditionally predominant notion of what religious freedom is, which is to say it's an individual right of personal conscience. Now, I don't want to push too strongly on the question of whether certain conceptions are associated with different religions, because you can push that way too much. But just as others have argued that the human rights tradition is associated with Protestant religion, so certainly it has been argued many times, and I think fairly forcefully, that this notion of protecting individual religious conscience grew out of a distinctive religious tradition. A Protestant tradition is connected with that. And while it has been applied to all different faiths, it seems to me that one focuses on faith, religion as faith, and on religion as individual conscience. This is a fabric which does not fit all forms equally and may seem on some bodies like a suit formed to fit the body of another. There have been in the United States some recent cases involving a different sort of question that doesn't seem reducible, or at least obviously reducible, to the question of individual conscience, and those address the prerogatives of religious institutions. Most notably, the question of whether there can be discrimination of different sorts in selecting clergymen. To what extent should religious institutions have prerogatives in their choice of clergy which even override other generally applicable laws? And here, those who say that the church should have these prerogatives were arguing, it seemed to me, not primarily from a sense of individual conscience, but from a sense of individual prerogative. Right? And yet this did not make it any less salient as a matter of individual freedom, at least in their minds, not even in my mind. It seemed to me rather that this notion of institutional prerogative was a separate, equally important strand in religious freedom discourse, the individualism and the institutionalism. But here, when I thought of the different sorts of claims that minority religious groups might have, that even these two together don't necessarily cover the waterfront, and that there is a third that should be articulated. I was not familiar with anyone who had articulated it in quite the way that I had in mind, this notion of religious freedom not so much as a protection of individuals nor even of institutions, but of peoples. And yet, while there hasn't been this discussion that I've seen, maybe there is, but I haven't seen it, of this protection of peoples as a matter of religious freedom, there are aspects of it that have been described and that have been identified from deeply within certainly the American tradition. Three aspects of it, one of which the notion that religious freedom has at least a significant element of equality to it. And there has been even a shift in American constitutional law towards a greater emphasis on equality. And there are at this table some who have written powerfully on this. In addition to this notion of equality rather than just liberty, there's this question of group rights rather than just individual rights, which again has had some attention. And third is this notion that there are, at a minimum, continuities between religion and race. I mean, one thing that seemed to me interesting looking at the various early civil rights statutes is that no one has been able to explain why certain provisions, given a good explanation that I've seen, why certain provisions do or don't mention national origin, or why they do or don't mention religion. In general, they mention race, color, national origin, and creed, or race, color, national origin, and religion as if it were a term of art as opposed to several discrete pieces, and yet they're interpreted as if they are entirely discrete and separate, when in fact the way that they're added in legislation, even in places where the individual parts don't make sense, suggests to me almost as if it's one single idea. So there are these three parts, this notion of equality, the notion of group, and the notion of religion as having continuities with race, which to me form at least the greater outlines of this notion of a people. And it seems to me that the peoplehood has demands on religious freedom, which are of equivalent stature to those of individual conscience or institutional prerogative. As this idea occurred to me, there seemed to be a few ramifications. If this is true, there are going to be cases where the three align and where therefore it would seem that the claims of religious freedom would be strongest. Times when they appear to conflict, where some resolution needs to be found. But beyond that, if it is the case that there are these three separate, distinctive, but equally dignified notions of religious freedom, it might be that there is argument not only that they should all be recognized, but especially if each of them has a different sort of connection to a faith tradition, then the prospect that we recognized one more than the other also raises, at a minimum, questions of fairness and questions as to whether a commitment to pluralism requires that the different commitments of religious freedom be recognized in a way which is at least roughly comparable. So what I argue in this paper is that there are three distinct traditions. They have not been equally protected, nor have they been equally recognized or articulated, but that an appropriate notion of religious freedom should give at least roughly equivalent regard to the three.